Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was a genius and was born with a red hair. Naruto was born with hair as red as his mother's, but with a face and intellect that paralleled his father, the Fourth Hokage. Will the revolution he brings be the world's salvation or destruction? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 13, Goodbye Memory. The next few rounds of the preliminary went by fairly quickly. In the second round, Tenten and the other Suna genin were overwhelmed by a Suna genin named Tamari, who'd simply blown away all the artillery with a giant metal fan. In the next bracket, Rai lucked out. It turned out that the two other genin, a Suna and an Ame genin, hated each other's guts and spent all of their energy trying to beat the other. When the Ame genin narrowly emerged victorious, Rai pounced and made short work of him. Nice work, Kakashi praised Rai, who clambered over the sandy barrier with a triumphant grin. Good job, said Kabuto, pushing up his glasses. Tenten, who was standing nearby, regarded Rai with a sour look. Did you see that move I made at the end there? Said Rai, swiping the air with his kunai. It was like... Oh please, Tenten cut in with a snort, folding her arms across her chest. All you did was stand around and try to look invisible for most of that round. Though she'd been promptly restored to working condition by the medic Nin, it seemed her pride had not yet made a full recovery. Rai turned to her with a irritated look on his face. Don't you have somewhere else to be? Like the stands? Tenten scowled. You wouldn't have done any better than me if you were up against an actual opponent. Oh yeah. Rai growled. I guess we'll see in the third exam about that, then. The third exam you won't be participating in. Tenten reddened, and for a second, Naruto thought she would hit him. But then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stiffly walked away. As Rai fumed, from the corner of his eye, Naruto saw Mei biting her lip, as though debating within herself whether or not to talk. Your abilities and fighting style are fairly similar to Tenten's, Naruto remarked. You might not have won against that Suna genin either. Rai's jaw dropped. What? She was just upset she lost, Mei piped in, looking upset. You shouldn't have taunted her like that. Rai slowly looked back and forth between them, before shaking his head. You two are never on my side, he groaned. I'm just stating facts, said Naruto matter-of-factly. Rai turned towards his last hope with a pleading look. Kabuto. Sorry Rai, but I'll have to agree with the rest on this one, Kabuto said with an apologetic smile. Rai let out a long-suffering sigh. Fine, he said, throwing his hands up. Fine. I'll go apologize. Hunched over, he slunk into the throng of genin. Kakashi, who had been wordlessly watching the situation unfold, finally let out a chuckle. You all rather remind me of my own team back in the day. Feeling a lick of curiosity welling up, Naruto turned toward the Jonin. What was your team like, sensei? We were always fighting, was all Kakashi said, before turning to look back at the arena. Naruto's gaze lingered on his sensei, he seemed distracted. Ever since his own match had ended, Kakashi had been sneaking discreet glances at him every now and then, before shaking his head and looking away. Was it because of that thing Rai had said? Jinchuriki. He'd been meaning to ask Rai about it, but with Rai's battle being so soon after his, he hadn't gotten a chance to. And now, he was off doing who knew what. But what could Rai have been talking about? Jinchuriki, was it a code name for something else? Shaking his head to clear it, Naruto turned to look back at the arena as well. The second half of the preliminaries was starting now, and the first ones up were. Well, that's rotten luck, said Kabuto. They're both on the same team, aren't they? Neji Hyuga and Rock Lee. I wonder if that's why Tenten was so upset, said Mayu slowly. Since she lost, and Neji and Lee are in the same bracket, only one member on their team gets to pass to the third exam. Naruto silently observed the three figures who stood in the center of the arena. Neji, with his arms crossed, was an emotionless wall. Rock Lee on the other hand, had an interesting mix of determination and anxiety etched across his face. Looking over the third genin, a jittery-looking Suna, with a practiced eye, Naruto mentally dismissed him from the battle. This would come down to be a fight between the two male Konoha rookies. Begin, said Seititsu, who leaped out of the arena. The Tsunagenin immediately jumped away from the Konoha-nin, pulling the bandaged humanoid puppet off his back. Lee, said Neji, ignoring the Tsunagenin completely. He stood stock still. Forfeit now. You've never beaten me, and you never will. Rock Lee lowered himself into a taijutsu stance. Neji, I respect you as a genius. But as I am sure you know by now, I never give up. Neji shook his head, and lowering himself into a stance, the veins around his eyes bulged outwards as the boy activated his infamous heritage. The fight was over in less than 5 minutes. At first, Lee seemed to be moving too quickly for Neji to follow, making sure to stay out of his reach. When the Tsunagenin distracted Neji with his puppet, Lee finally jumped in for his attack, but unfortunately for him, nothing got past the Byakugan's all-seeing power. As soon as Lee was in Neji's reach, it was all over him. With what seemed like a series of gentle jabs to Lee's torso and legs, the boy crumpled to the ground. The Tsunagenin soon followed after, being easily incapacitated with a few jabs to the hands controlling the puppet. The winner of preliminary round 4 is Neji Hyuga. Without a look back at his teammate who still lay on the ground, Neji left the arena. It's unfortunate, but Rock Lee wouldn't have stood a chance against any competent ninja, let alone a genius like Hyuga, said Kabuto, adjusting his glasses. What do you mean? Asked Mayu curiously. He can't use any ninjutsu or genjutsu. It's amazing that he's come this far with just taijutsu, but, this is where the road ends for him, came the answer. They fell silent, and soon after, Kabuto excused himself, returning to his teammates. It took a second for Naruto to realize that Mayu had also wordlessly begun walking towards the arena. Naruto's gaze lowered to her trembling hands, and he let out an internal sigh. With that kind of mentality going in, he doubted she'd come out victorious. He looked towards her opponents. Fu and another Ame-genin were already waiting inside the arena. As his gaze fell on the Taki-genin, the girl seemed to notice. Turning around, she locked gazes with him for a second. Then, baring her teeth at him, Fu gave him a sarcastic little wave before returning her attention to the others in the arena. Bemused, Naruto cocked his head, his thoughts returning once more to Rai's words and Kakashi's strange reaction towards them. Fu. He said her name out loud quietly. Rai had called her a Jinchuriki, but what did that even mean? Maybe Rai had been messing around like usual, and it hadn't meant anything. But Kakashi's reaction had been strange, so perhaps there was something else to it that he was missing? Naruto's forehead furrowed, and he reached up to massage his temple with his hand. His head was starting to throb again. Wincing, Naruto glanced sideways at Kakashi. He opened his mouth, and then hesitated. Should he ask the Jonin? Normally, he wouldn't have hesitated. If there was anyone he trusted, it was his sensei. But Kakashi's previously bizarre reaction gave him pause. He squeezed his temples. It was getting harder to think straight with his head aching like this. Was this another relapse of that weird desert sickness? How come he was sick, anyways, while no one else was? Naruto, are you alright? Naruto almost jumped in surprise, before returning to his senses. How odd, he'd nearly forgotten that the Jonin was there. With a mental shrug, he decided that it couldn't hurt to ask. What had he been going to ask again? In some distant part of his mind, alarm bells were ringing, but for some reason, Naruto was finding it hard to focus on them. Dazedly, he looked back at the arena. The round had started. Mayu was racing away, while the genin from Takigakure was spewing a shiny powder that hurt his eyes. What had been the girl's name again? Naruto. His eyes widened as he actually jumped this time. He'd forgotten Kakashi-sensei was there again. What was going on? What was wrong with his mind? He felt like he was drowning in an increasingly thicker fog. Focus, Naruto, he told himself, massaging his temples. Closing his eyes, he mentally retreated to his sanctuary. Here, he had studied all of his difficult taijutsu stances and committed his jutsu to memory. But to his immense shock, whereas he had previously imagined it as a great expanse of nothing, there was something else there now, a giant, bulky gelatin-like block that was rapidly expanding in all directions even now. But, there. It hadn't taken over completely just yet. Naruto dove to grasp the fleeting thought before it was crushed for good under the block. Sensei, do you know what Rai meant by a Jinchuriki? He managed to choke out. What? Kakashi sounded taken aback. So, you don't know what he meant? No. But, Naruto stopped with a hiss as he was forcibly ejected from his own sanctuary. He let out a groan, as the wave of pain collapsed over him. Everything around him was beginning to spin dizzily, just like it had several days ago. What's wrong? Kakashi's voice was muted and distant, as if he were talking to him through a thick wall. Naruto staggered, his hands falling limply to his sides. The air was thick and hazy, and his mouth felt like a leaden lump of clay. He mumbled something through a thick tongue, before everything turned black. As she slowly walked into the arena, there were so many thoughts and voices in her head that Maya was starting to feel rather sick. It was a tumultuous cacophony, a restless tornado that raged through her mind. There was no time to breathe or think. Only react. I thought we had agreed that you were going to keep your distance from it. She skipped the academy today again. You don't mean you're making a cake for that thing, are you? Get away from him. He'll kill you. He's a monster. Where are you going? Maya flinched in surprise, and then stumbled. Regaining her bearings, she looked around in a daze. Her surroundings had suddenly changed. She was already at the center of the sandy arena, where an Amegenin and Fu waited for her. Maya blinked. Fu had been the one to call out to her. Are you ready? The Suna Jonin growled, glaring around at them. Maya's eyes darted away, not wanting to meet his eyes. Then, begin. The Amegenin immediately jumped into the air, lifting his umbrella and spinning it to release a torrent of deadly poison-tipped needles. Fu hopped away, while Mayu, almost tripping again, just barely managed to get out of range. Hiden, Rinpungaku no Jutsu, secret, hiding in scale powder technique. Fu used the same jutsu she had used on them earlier in the tunnels, exhaling a blindingly bright powder from her mouth. Reacting instinctively, Maya screwed her eyes shut, running as fast as she could. Judging by the outraged howl of surprise from the Amegenin, he hadn't fared as well. When Maya felt it safe enough to open her eyes again a few seconds later, sure enough, he was already slumped on the ground. She watched as Fu straightened over his body. Casually, the green-haired girl stretched her arms back behind her body, reminding her for some odd reason of an insect extending its scaly wings. Then, just as casually, Fu looked directly over at where Maya stood. Here I come. She said brightly, pointing her finger in her direction. Maya froze, her eyes widening. Unable to move, she watched as Fu took a deliberate slow step towards her. It was just her and the monster again. The monster took another step towards her. And then another. And another. Maya couldn't move. All she could do was stand there, watching the sand below the monster's sandals billow in all directions with every step closer to her. Another step. The pause between each step was growing shorter. Step. Step. The monster would be here soon. Move, she tried to scream at herself. Move, or you'll die. Maya whimpered, but she couldn't move. There was a glass tunnel, long and narrow, that was trapping her therein with the monster. She couldn't move nor breathe, the only way to move was forward, where the monster was waiting. The monster was close now. The monster was raising her hands, the corners of her mouth were turning upwards, and she could see a glimpse of sharp, glinting teeth. I'm scared. Maya's lips cracked open. She wanted to cry out for help. Where were her teammates? Her gaze searchingly flicked sideways to the jeering audience. But she couldn't see anyone she recognized. It was a sea of blank faces. I'm so scared. The monster had taken out a kunai now. But she still couldn't move. All she could do was watch the kunai, so reminiscent of a fang, make its way towards her in a slow, downward arc. I'm scared. Mayu. A voice bellowed, cutting through the haze. As though she'd been splashed in ice-cold water, Mayu jerked in surprise, and finding she could move again, just barely managed to throw herself out of the way. As soon as she hit the ground, Mayu somersaulted back onto her feet, pulling a kunai out of her pouch and holding it above her with a shaking hand. Fu looked at her with a bemused expression, and in the moment of stillness, Mayu glanced back at the spectators again. She found Rai immediately. His face was stark white as he stared back at her, the thick scar on his cheek standing out prominently. Naruto and Kakashi-sensei were gone, and somehow, she knew that Naruto must have collapsed again. The memory of finding him unconscious in his room several days ago suddenly flashed through her mind. She had been scared then, too. "Are you always this scared when your teammates aren't around?" the girl asked, casually tossing the kunai around in her hands. Her orange eyes flashed dangerously, and her smile grew a little more strained. "Or do you know what I am?" To her surprise, Mayu found herself opening her mouth to speak. "I'm always scared," she replied in an unexpectedly calm voice. "I've been scared of everything for years." Fu cocked her head. "What kind of way to live is that?" Mayu's grip on her kunai tightened painfully. "It's no way to live," she said, and threw the kunai. Fu jerked back, but the kunai never even went near her. Instead, it pierced through the air with a shattering sound before landing harmlessly on the ground at the other side of the arena. "I'm scared, but I'm tired of being scared." "Naruto, what's wrong?" Kakashi asked, watching in alarm as the genin's face turned an ashen gray. Naruto stumbled. Reacting instinctively, Kakashi caught him before he fell. "Sensei, my head." Naruto's eyes rolled back, and his body went limp in Kakashi's arms. His free eye widened in shock. "Naruto!" Rai was finally back. Looking worried, he raced forward to help, but stopped in his tracks at Kakashi's expression. "No. It couldn't be." Kakashi murmured to himself, shaking his head. He anxiously stared down at Naruto's slack face. Over the years, as he watched the boy grow up from afar, he'd sometimes had his doubts and wondered about its possibility before. Even just today, he had felt uneasy when he heard about Naruto's recent sudden illness. After some contemplation, however, he'd dismissed it all as simple paranoia. But just now, the boy had fainted as soon as he broached the subject. This wasn't some psychological issue, it went far beyond that. This was an external cause. And it sounded very similar to the effects of something he'd once been very familiar with during the war. "It couldn't be," he repeated miserably. That couldn't be what he meant. "What are you talking about, sensei?" Rai said, sounding upset. "What's wrong with Naruto? Is he sick again?" Kakashi straightened up, lifting up Naruto in his arms. "I'm going to take Naruto to a medic, Rai. I want you to stay here to cheer Mayu on," he said quietly. "But when I come back, I want you to tell me everything you know about Jinchuriki." Many miles away in the Fire Country, the venerable Third Hokage Hiruzen Sarutobi looked outside at the setting sun from his office, his trusty pipe smoking in his hand. He hummed, watching the last rays strike the familiar busts of the past Hokage. The days were growing longer as spring approached, and he was glad. The past winter had been a long and severe one. His thoughts turned toward the Chunin exams that were currently taking place in Sunagakure. Several of Konoha's promising genins were participating this year, including Gai's rookies. Hiruzen was quite looking forward to seeing how they would be performing, particularly the Hyuga genius. There hadn't been a user of the Byakugan with as much promise in so many years. It was just a pity that he was from the branch house. Unless the main house changed their ways, then the boy's talents would never be used to their full extent. Knowing Gai's way of instructing his students with the greatest care, however, Hiruzen hadn't expected them to participate this year. He smiled, his temples wrinkling. It was probably because Kakashi, Gai's greatest rival, had entered his team in the exams this year. And on Kakashi's team was Hiruzen stilled. The smile faded, and he turned away from the window. He couldn't bear to look out and see Minato's face staring accusingly back at him. Sitting down at his desk, Hiruzen steepled his hands together. Every day, he wondered if he had made the right choice. Granted, it had been the only choice at the time. Such was the way of fate. And yet, he wondered, was fate really such an unmovable force? 11 years ago, and then 5 years ago. Hokage-sama. A silver-haired Umbu stumbled into the Hokage's office. There were several Chunin standing in front of the Hokage, but ignoring protocol, he ripped off his animal mask to reveal his face. "Dog!" Hiruzen admonished. The Chunin beside him immediately averted their eyes. Hiruzen signaled for the Chunin to leave before turning to face the upset young ninja standing before him. "What is the matter? Is it true?" Kakashi demanded, once all of the Chunin had filed out of the room. "That the Nine Tails attacked? And that there were casualties?" "Yes," said the elder shinobi heavily. "But, how?" Hiruzen raised his hand. "Now is not the time. It will all be explained soon. For now, know that it has been subjugated and resettled back in its host." Kakashi's eyes narrowed. "And what have you done with him?" The boy was understandably distraught when he reached consciousness. "For now he's been put to sleep, while the counselors and I discuss what to do with him." "It's true then," said Kakashi quietly, "that the council wants him dead?" "There have been some suggestions concerning different ways of quelling the host." Kakashi slammed the wall with his fist. "Naruto's still just a child. You can't blame him for something like this." "And I don't," said Hiruzen gently. "You need not worry for him, he has been put under high security guard to prevent anything from happening to him. More like you're putting him under guard so to make people feel more at ease." Kakashi muttered. "Even though the Nine Tails has been resettled, he is still a danger, Kakashi." Hiruzen shook his head wearily. "Especially with the state his mind is currently in, most likely, he and the other witnesses will have to have their minds wiped of the memory. And then? The boy turns 6 tomorrow, yes," said Hiruzen, clasping his hands behind his back. He turned to Kakashi. "I think it is about time he has begun to be trained. He will be placed back in his apartment by tomorrow morning, with no memory of today's events. Could you bring him to my office then?" Kakashi numbly nodded. He didn't seem altogether pleased, but he seemed reassured that the Hokage had not given in to village pressure and dealt with his teacher's son much more harshly. Turning around, the Umbu left without another word. Hiruzen sighed as the door slammed shut. As upset as Kakashi already was, he hadn't thought it prudent to fully clue him in on everything that was to be done regarding the boy. He himself would have preferred any other possible alternate method. But it had been the only way to pacify the counselors while giving him as normal a childhood as possible. Such a potent seal, he murmured to himself. Minato would be furious to know his own creation would be used on his son. He looked down at his lined hands silently, he would do the deed himself. All the blame would be his. Chapter 14, Lightning Speed. Much like the other buildings in Tsunagakure, the infirmary was a hive of dimly lit rooms and connecting hallways, and as such, it was only by chance that Kakashi noticed Mei being carried past on a stretcher. Once he'd affirmed that Naruto's condition had stabilized, he had worried over her battle against Fu, and as soon as he saw the blue hair clips attached to a mop of sandy hair, Kakashi jumped to his feet and stopped the medic Nin in order to check on her. But even without the medic assuring him that she would be alright, with just a cursory look over, he could tell that his fears had been groundless. Mei was bleeding from what looked like multiple tiny perforations on her arms, but that appeared to be the extent of her injuries. She was breathing steadily, with no irregularities in her pulse. It appeared she was merely unconscious. Relaxing, Kakashi nodded, and stepped back, allowing the medic to direct her stretcher to another room. Just as he'd walked back through the doorway, he saw Naruto's eyes snap open. Leaving the stunned boy to stare up at the clay ceiling from his prone position in bed, Kakashi locked the door behind him and checked the room once more. They were the only occupants in the room, and the medic who had been attending to Naruto had long since left. But of course, that didn't mean anything in a hidden village like Tsunagakure. He would have preferred to take Naruto to a more secure location, but to do so now would attract unwanted attention. Passing his hand over his face, Kakashi lifted his hitayate to reveal his Sharingan. Glancing around, he was rewarded with a small chakra presence perched on top of the rim of the nearest window. "Kakashi-sensei?" Naruto asked in a taut voice. "What happened? I passed out again, didn't I?" Without responding, Kakashi leisurely ambled over to the window. Pretending to look outside at the view of the drab, open field of sand in deep contemplation, he saw that the source of the chakra was a harmless beetle on the outside. The inside on the other hand was a whole different story. From what he could tell by its thin string of light chakra that jutted out from its posterior and led out of the room, it was a modified puppet, possibly with the added capability of recording conversations. Ingenious, what some of their jutsu could accomplish. However, with an idle flick of his fingers, Kakashi squashed the insect against the wall, before turning back to face the genin. As soon as he met the boy's blue eyes, he internally winced. The pressure of the daunting task that loomed before him weighed down on him all at once like a massive boulder. Kakashi pinched the bridge of his nose, gathering his thoughts together. Nevertheless, it has to be done. And with that thought in mind, he let out another exhale. Naruto, he began at last, before anything, I would like to apologize. The genin looked taken aback. Apologize? What for, sensei? In my defense. Kakashi paused. No, I have no defense. The truth of the matter is that everyone, including me, has been lying to you for your entire life. I could have done something about it, but I never did. I'm sorry. I see. To Kakashi's surprise, Naruto's gaze sharpened. And I suppose these lies have something to do with why I am passing out. Are you going to tell me what these lies are? Yes, he replied, and was gratified to see a look of surprise flash across the genin's face. I'm going to tell you everything that I know, consequences be damned. While it isn't much, it's the very least you deserve. Kakashi trailed off, as a sudden thought struck him. I'm assuming that you want to hear the truth. Yes, sensei, said Naruto immediately. Right now, please. Kakashi nodded. Very well. But there's one thing I'm going to ask of you. And that's to hear me out in its entirety. Some news will, be shocking to you, but I want you to stay here on your bed. In return, I promise you that I will tell you the entire truth as I know it. Yes, sensei, Naruto said, his tone now touched by a slight flavor of impatience. All right then. Kakashi took a deep breath. Might as well get it over with from the get-go. You are a Jinchuriki? At these words, he noted that Naruto's face remained unchanged, but could sense his body tensing up. That means that you are the host of a tailed beast. In your case, during its invasion of Konoha, the Nine Tails, Kyuubi, was sealed within you when you were a newborn baby. The Kyuubi wasn't destroyed? Naruto asked, raising a fist to clear his throat. His face was otherwise, curiously devoid of emotion. I thought the Fourth Hokage defeated it. Tailed beasts aren't so simply defeated, Naruto, said Kakashi. They're mammoth living forms of chakra, the best we can do is seal them away. And most villages take advantage of this by sealing them inside another living vessel, a human. Was it a complete seal? Is that even possible? How come it's never gotten out? Naruto frowned. It has, hasn't it? Kakashi nodded. Correct. However, from what I know, there has been only one incident so far in which the Kyuubi managed to temporarily escape its seal. It happened when you were 6, or actually, the day before your 6th birthday. Some foreign ninja somehow managed to get intel on you and infiltrated Konoha. In the incident, you lost control and managed to kill them all. But I don't remember. There are gaps in your memory, Naruto. Ever since that day, for 5 years now, there has been a seal on some of your memories. It was curious and yet disheartening to observe the careful look of calm beginning to fall apart on the genin's face, like cracks in a sheet of ice that had frozen over a raging river. Before he could be swept away in its current, Kakashi hurriedly pressed on. It is a type of forbidden fuinjutsu called the Genkoken Fun, taboo seal. It was invented by the Fourth Hokage, and was popularly used during the Third Shinobi World War. It works by making a word or idea taboo in someone's mind. Anytime they begin thinking about it, the seal immediately sucks the memory away. People whose mental resilience is strong enough tend to unconsciously fight this, and suffer tremendous headaches as a result. That's the reason why you've been falling unconscious. Your mind has been fighting with the seal, trying to hold on to your memories. As a temporary measure, I've put a block on the seal for now, which is why, as I tell you this, you aren't falling unconscious. Naruto's hands fell by his side. A long, terse silence entangled itself around them. Looking at the mixture of feelings playing out across his student's normally stoic face, Kakashi had to hold himself back from sighing. Ninja lived harsh, often unjust lives, and it was something that he had come to accept a long time ago as a child himself. But something about the way Naruto's face looked like just now brought back memories of those gray, rain-drenched days he'd spent in the reflection of the cold memorial stone. "Why me?" Naruto finally let out. "The fourth Hokage chose you," Kakashi replied. "Why?" Naruto repeated, shaking his head. Kakashi hesitated. "Please, sensei." "Because you were his son," he said quietly. "What?" Naruto blurted out, looking at Kakashi in naked disbelief. "But that's... Your father was Namikaze Minato, the fourth Hokage," Kakashi pressed on. "He was my teacher, and a legendary shinobi renowned as Konoha's Yellow Flash. He died a hero, saving the village by sealing the Kyuubi inside his own child, you." Naruto didn't respond, and as Kakashi watched the genin's eyes slowly turn dull, the weight on his back seemed to grow heavier and heavier. He wondered if he had made a mistake, not about putting a stop to the memory seal, but about the timing of it all. Perhaps he should have waited for a more optimal time before revealing the truth to the boy? But with the memory seal quarantined off, Naruto would have woken up immediately knowing that something was off, and it would have been damaging to their tentative trust if Kakashi had continued denying him the truth of everything. "I can't say that I understand completely why Minato-sensei made his decision," said Kakashi, choosing his next words with care. "And I know you were in a lot of pain growing up because of that. We were all forbidden to tell you anything, because we were told it would be safer for you to remain ignorant of your circumstances. But, I want you to know that your father must have had a very good reason to do so, because that's just the type of ninja he was. His last wish was for you to be seen as a hero." After the preliminaries ended, they were granted 2 weeks' time to recover and to train for the upcoming final exam. For most of the time, Naruto threw himself into solitary training, doing his best to keep himself busy while staying away from the others. Rai similarly squirreled off into training under the tutelage of Kakashi, whereas Mayu disappeared for long periods of time, seemingly touring the village. The days dragged by, but eventually the morning of the third exam arrived, and Naruto was again set to go first. The exam was held in a much fancier stadium than where the preliminaries had taken place in. The walls were made of hardened clay that reached up around 15 feet around the circular, level platform. The audience sat on rows on top of these walls. Suna Umbu were positioned strategically in the audience both as bodyguards for the high-ranking officials as well as preventative measures, in case any fights got out of hand. The first match of the day set Naruto against one of Tsunagakure's favorites, a blonde Suna genin named Temari, who was apparently the daughter of the Kazekage. Naruto had noticed her earlier. From what he'd seen, she was quick-footed and clever, with a bit of a cruel streak in her tendency to play with weaker opponents. Her weapon of choice was a giant folding fan, and just as the match begun, she'd flown at him on top of it, catching him off guard enough for her to land a glancing blow off of his leg. But in the end, she was no match for him. As soon as Naruto recovered, quickly gathering that her weakness was close-range combat, he made short work of her with the help of several Kage Bunshin. When he walked out of the enclosed arena, the ensuing polite applause did little to conceal the sullen expressions of the watching Suna audience. The next match was between Rai and Neji, in which Rai held up surprisingly well despite the hype that had surrounded the Hyuga boy. Keeping up a steady stream of kunai, his teammate was able to surprise everyone in the stadium, Neji included, by channeling his chakra into some of the kunai and exploding them as they lay scattered around his opponent's feet. Though Neji noticed them in time and managed to avoid most of the fiery explosions, Rai still managed to lightly scorch the stoic boy's leg. Unfortunately for him, this served only to irritate Neji, who'd seemed to be trying to conserve energy by remaining on the defense. Going on the offensive, he managed to corner Rai, and with several well-placed hits, Rai was soon on the ground coughing up blood. After Rai was carried out on a stretcher, Naruto did not pay much attention to the following 2 fights, though he noted that the girl from Takigakure, Fu, who'd beaten Mayu in the preliminaries, defeated her opponent with ease. Rai had called her the Jinchuriki before. That could mean only one thing, that she was the host of a tailed beast, just like him. Undoubtedly, she would make it to the finals, and if the sharp look she'd shot in his direction was any inclination, she expected the same of him. In a detached sort of way, Naruto wondered if she knew the truth about him as well. He wouldn't be too surprised, as it seemed he hadn't ever known anything about himself. With the first round of the matches done, there was a brief break, likely more for the benefit of the watching daimyo than the participants. As Kakashi and Mayu had gone to check on Rai in the infirmary, Naruto sat alone drinking out of a water skin, not paying much attention to his surroundings. Suddenly, a side of his face was relieved from the burning sun as it fell in shadow. Naruto put his water skin down, and turned to see the Hyuga boy staring down at him with his arms crossed. His eyes trailed down first to the burn on his leg that his teammate had so graciously given. It looked a bit more raw and painful than it had seemed down in the arena. "We'll be fighting against each other in the next round," said Neji shortly, and Naruto looked back up. "It's supposed to be randomized," he pointed out. The matchups for the winners of the initial round, Neji, Fu, Asuna Genin who used puppets, and himself, were picked out from a public drawing. Everyone knows it's a farce. "They'll want to knock out at least one Genin from Konoha," Neji said flatly. Naruto felt a flicker of irritation. "What's your point?" "Before we fight, I wanted to tell you something. In this world, as I'm sure you've realized, there is the elite, and then there are the outcasts. We can change our physical appearance and improve our skills with training and study, but ultimately, we are judged by what we cannot change. What can't be changed must be endured. We are who we are, and we must live with it, and with my Byakugan, I can see many things. I've seen how you strive to be the best, so that you can become Hokage." Neji's eyes hardened. "An outcast like you or me could never become the Hokage. Keep that in mind." The shade on his face moved away, and Naruto was left alone once more. He picked his water skin up again, and drank. He hadn't expected such a direct psychological attack like that. If surprise had been its intended effect, it had worked. However, his last wish was for you to be seen as a hero. Naruto's lips curved upwards in a humorless smile. Neji needn't have wasted his breath, he'd already known everything he'd said was true. Soon, the second half of the third exam began, and true enough, Naruto and Neji were matched up for the first battle. When the bald-headed proctor looked up at him expectantly from the arena, Naruto exhaled. Throwing the empty water skin aside carelessly, he jumped down from his seat down into the stage, sending up tufts of sand as he landed. Neji was already waiting for him. As the crowd buzzed in excitement and the proctor roared something about their shared backgrounds, neither one said anything. For a moment, the two were completely still, simply eyeing each other from across the field. Naruto noticed that the pale-eyed boy was slightly favoring one leg. He'd had some cooling paste dabbed over the burn since they'd talked, but it must have been bothering him. As if reading his thoughts, Neji spoke up. "This injury will make no difference in the outcome," he said coolly. "After all, my Byakugan shows me many." "Yes, good for you," Naruto cut in. Neji's eyes narrowed, and he continued to glare at him, until Naruto looked away. He waited for the countdown wearily. Fleetingly, as the sun's white rays beat harshly down on his face, he wondered what he was doing there on that arena. "Begin." Naruto automatically lowered into a basic defensive stance, waiting for Neji to make the first move. Dully, he recounted what he'd learned about the Kekai Genkai. Though the Hyuga clan was understandably tight-lipped about it, there were some basic things one could gather about it just by sparring with one of their clansmen. There had been a Hyuga member from the branch in his class, and he'd been able to gather several things from her, the most important one being that the Byakugan, at its most basic, granted its user the ability to see everything at the chakra level. This meant that they could see through solid objects, and illusions such as clones meant nothing to them. Furthermore, as he'd gathered from Neji and Lee's fight, their fighting style took advantage of their Byakugan to make common taijutsu into something much more destructive. "Byakugan!" cried Neji. Sure enough, the veins around his eyes visibly bulged as the boy activated his infamous heritage. Once activated, he glared at Naruto without making another move. It was clear that he wanted Naruto to make the first move. There were a variety of ways he could deal with this. Most people would probably take the long-range approach to avoid Neji's taijutsu. After a split second's deliberation, he decided. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. 4 exact copies of himself immediately materialized in a cloud of white smoke. From what he knew of the way the Byakugan worked, Neji shouldn't be able to discern his real self from among his clones. In one fluid motion with his clones, Naruto drew his tanto from his back. He and his clones shot towards Neji, who pulled out his kunai. Metal met metal harshly as his clones kept the pale-eyed genin busy, and at the edges, Naruto continuously feinted in and out. To Neji's credit, despite having 5 Narutos converge on him from all directions, he left no openings, and Naruto only managed to get in a few shallow cuts. However, as soon as his summoned clones began to erupt into pillars of smoke, he summoned more, each time managing to get in some more shallow cuts. Slowly but surely, Neji's legs and arms began to be covered in an abundance of cuts. His breathing grew more labored as his reflexes began to slow. As Neji thrust his kunai into his clone, turning them into smoke, Naruto gradually moved closer to Neji, swapping his original rear position with one of his clones. As another clone turned into smoke, Naruto moved in and aimed a kick at Neji's legs, which he dodged by leaping back. Simultaneously, however, Neji unconsciously turned away his scorched leg in an effort to protect it, a movement which cost him a split second. Predicting this, Naruto stepped behind him at the same time. Neji's eyes widened as he realized his back was exposed, but with no time to turn around, Naruto swung his tanto inwards in a sharp arc. Just before his blade made contact, however, he met a strange, almost immaterial barrier, and to his surprise, he was then immediately blasted back as Neji spun rapidly in a powerful circle, his black hair fanning around him. As Naruto hit the ground, his remaining clones, which had also been thrown back, disappeared into clouds of smoke. When Neji had stopped spinning, the sand around him had furrowed into a shallow hole. Naruto looked at the other genin in surprised silence, and in response, Neji smiled grimly. Despite the number of cuts on his body, he stood firm in his confidence. Spreading his feet apart, he bent down sideways, touching the back of his hand to his foot. "It's over now," said Neji coolly. "Gentle fist style, 8 trigrams 32 palms." Naruto let out a sigh. If Neji hit him with that, things could actually turn quite dangerous for him. He'd wanted to take his time whittling the other genin down with his clones, but it looked like that wasn't possible now. He hadn't wanted to use this again unless he had to, but... Stepping back, he lowered his body, allowing his muscles to relax. He felt the chakra that ebbed through his body. At his urging, he usually manipulated it into becoming sharp and thin to channel it into his weapons. This time, however, he twisted his chakra to curl in on itself into a ball, becoming tighter and tighter with each twist, until it began to vibrate. Sending it down his body, the ball expanded, enveloping his feet with a crackling sound. As this all happened, Neji swung his body around and then threw himself forward with both hands outstretched towards Naruto. The prospect of victory gleaming in his pale eyes, Neji was just about to make contact with the other genin, when, with a sudden loud cracking sound, he disappeared. A split millisecond later, Naruto was behind Neji, and before the other genin had even realized, he'd hit him hard on the back of his neck with the blunt end of his tanto. Slowly, as if even his body was refusing to accept it, Neji swayed, and then fell on his knees. He was unconscious before he slumped to the ground. The crowd cheered animatedly. Since Naruto could project his wind chakra into his weapons, he'd reasoned that he should be able to project his chakra through his body as well. But instead of wind chakra, which was best for offensive attacks, he'd decided to work on his speed. In order to do that, he had focused on manipulating his chakra into a different element, lightning. The first obstacle had been getting down the feel for what lightning chakra felt like. It was very different, in both shape and feel, from his natural affinity, wind chakra. As soon as he'd gotten the hang of it, Naruto had begun focusing on running the current through his entire body, with the idea of electrically stimulating his nervous system, and then almost immediately, abandoned the idea. He hadn't realized how painful it would be, or how much chakra it would consume to constantly be supplying his system with lightning chakra. After some pondering, Naruto had next focused on localizing the stimulation to just his lower legs and feet, as the body parts most farthest from his brain. He'd theorized that boosting them would provide the greatest improvement in his speed. And sure enough, though it did sting quite uncomfortably, hence why he avoided using it whenever possible, when his feet were stimulated with the lightning chakra, his enhanced kickoff greatly increased his initial speed and made it look, to the untrained eye, as if he had suddenly disappeared and then reappeared elsewhere. The sun was now high in the sky and it pounded on Naruto's neck as he looked down at Neji's prone body. A feeling he wouldn't have recognized before bubbled up inside him. But now that his eyes had been opened, he knew it as contempt for the trapped bird in a cage that had yearned to be loved by the cage. "You're pathetic," he said coldly. Yet even as he spoke, he did not know who his words were for. Naruto turned around and walked out of the arena, leaving the roar of the crowd's approval behind him. Chapter 15, The Promise to a Dream. Following Naruto's victory, the fight between Fu and the remaining Suna genin, an older boy named Kankuro, was short and decisive. Dressed in white with a dark skin tone, she physically stood out starkly besides Kankuro, who was light-skinned and wore all black. And once the match begun, the difference in their skills was made clear as well. Though he handled his puppet with clear talent, it was no match for the destructive cloud of termite-like insects that emerged from the red tube on Fu's back. Seeing the insects rapidly swarm across the ground towards him, Kankuro barely managed to get out of their way. As he did so, realizing that the insects could climb across chakra threads, he was forced to detach himself from his puppet. In a matter of seconds, they completely covered and stripped away the puppet's exterior, leaving behind only a wooden carcass which then collapsed in on itself. Apparently having sated their appetite, the insects then returned to Fu's tube. However, with his weapon gone, and clearly shaken by the ordeal, Kankuro soon surrendered, and to the groans of his watching Suna countrymen, he sheepishly plodded off the arena. After dusting herself off, Fu nonchalantly stretched backwards. Then, with glittering baleful eyes, she locked gazes with Naruto, who'd been blankly observing the battle. He stared back, and after a moment, she looked away. As the Jonin proctor told the audience there would be a brief intermission before the final match, Naruto noticed that a masked Jonin had just emerged from the infirmary building. Though he gave the man no further indication of his recognition, the man soon came and sat down next to him. "Hey," Kakashi greeted him. When Naruto didn't say anything in response, he let out a small cough. "I'm sorry I missed your match against the Hyuga kid. I got caught up with medical paperwork, HM. So, do you feel ready for the final match?" Naruto shrugged noncommittally. Rubbing the back of his neck, Kakashi sighed. "I won't push you, Naruto. Just know that you're not alone in this. I'm here, and your teammates are here to support you. At least in spirit." "Spare me the sentimentality, sensei," Naruto finally said, getting up. "There's no need for this. I'm perfectly aware of my current situation." Kakashi looked taken aback. "And what situation is that?" Naruto spread his arms wide in a sweeping motion. "This exam is a farce. Whether I win it or not, it'll make little difference in the way everyone looks at me. Even Mei and Rai would turn their backs on me if they knew, and you know it." Kakashi paused. "I haven't turned my back on you. You're different, sensei." Nonetheless, Naruto fell back in his seat. The tendril of unfamiliar anger that had flared up inside him just a moment ago had already faded away, leaving behind only a crushing weariness. "But nobody else will think that way. Nobody will ever acknowledge me. What's the point in trying? So you're saying your efforts were all to get people to acknowledge you? That doesn't sound like the Naruto I know." Naruto didn't respond. After several minutes of taut silence, Kakashi moved away. Looking out over the dusty, sand-filled arena and the rowdy crowd that filled the seats around them, Naruto cast his thoughts back to a time when he hadn't even been tall enough to open the window. It was back when Naruto still hadn't known what chakra was. His caretaker at the time always refused to open the window for him, saying that if he fell out and died, she would be blamed for it. So, in the summer when the nights were hottest and he found it difficult to breathe, Naruto would pile his wooden blocks on top of his tattered book of folk tales and carefully clamber on top of the teetering stack. Balancing his weight, he pushed up against the firmly closed window, and more often than not, he would lose his balance and fall over, the stack crashing painfully on top of him. But sometimes, the window budged open just slightly enough for a thin cool breeze to enter the room, and he would be able to breathe again. On those days, his dreams were always pleasant. Sometimes, he'd even dreamed that his parents, though always faceless, were alive and lived with him. Who'd have thought that in reality, It had been his own father who had sealed away a monster inside of him and sealed his fate forever. Closing his eyes tightly, Naruto shook his head, trying to clear away the memory. He'd once watched the sunset from that very window, hoping beyond hope that he would one day be accepted. He'd sworn that he would own the hearts of Konoha and that he would become Hokage. He'd fantasized about how people would regard him with awe as he walked down the village streets, looking at him with trust and respect in their eyes. He hadn't realized then that he was a wolf in human skin, but they'd known all along. They must have been laughing as he studied and practiced for hours every night in a vain effort to become one of them. Laughing as they sealed his memories, watching him lose himself piece by piece until he was only an empty shell. He could tell that even Kakashi-sensei's concern stemmed from the pity one reserved for the most pathetic of creatures, the ones that tried to become what they were not. A bitter smile stretched itself across his face. The worst part of it all was that even knowing the truth, somewhere deep inside of him, he still craved their acceptance. As the final match of the Chunin exam, the victor will be decided only by killing or incapacitating his opponent, the proctor informed the watching audience. And in this battle, we have Uzumaki Naruto from Konohagakure and Fu from Takigakure. Waiting for the signal to start, Naruto took in his opponent. As she had done with the Suna Genin, her figure also made an odd contrast to his own, with his black tracksuit, and his red hair and blue eyes. Noticing his gaze, Fu looked back at him and crossing her arms, smiled darkly. His eyes narrowed, her stance screamed of confidence. Was she going to use her Jinchuriki powers? He thought it unlikely. If Jinchuriki truly were taboo, as it seemed to be, then Fu would likely be under strict orders from her village to not reveal her Jinchuriki status. As it was so far, she hadn't shown any signs of it, but that could simply have been because she had not been pushed enough. Whatever the case, one thing was clear, she was dangerous, and he knew next to nothing about her, making the situation doubly dangerous. He stopped. Unconsciously, he'd begun analyzing her out of pure habit. But did it really matter? As he'd told Kakashi-sensei, the outcome of this match meant nothing. Begin. Unlike with his match against Neji, Naruto made the first move. Gathering his lightning chakra to his feet, he drew a kunai and sprang at her. The proctor's words were still reverberating through the arena when Naruto appeared in a flash behind her. Without hesitating, he slashed downwards at her exposed neck. But to his alarm, the blade did not pierce her as expected, but instead, bounced off. Hiden, Rinpungaku no Jutsu, secret, hiding in scale powder technique. Fu shouted just as, despite his surprise, he flashed away. Nevertheless, several particles ended up in his eyes, filling his vision with bright painful spots. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, shadow clone technique. To buy time, Naruto blindly summoned several clones into the arena. Jumping backwards, he let them siege the Taki Genin as he recovered and processed the newest addition to his mental profile of her. Her skin had felt oddly thick and stiff, almost like armor, or a shell. A simple blade obviously would not be enough. Just as the last clone burst into smoke, his vision returned to functioning level. Fu had been driven back by his clones, but now, was quickly advancing on him head first. In a single fluid motion, Naruto drew his tanto from his back. Furrowing his brow in concentration, he ran 2 fingers down its blade, running a current of wind chakra down its edge. Next, he ran back up, layering another current of chakra above it. He could sense the 2 opposing currents grounding against each other, finally sharpening the blade. Eyeing his opponent, he stepped backwards, shaping and directing his chakra towards the heel of his foot as he ground it into the sand. Fu tensed and began to slow down. Naruto exploded towards her, holding the tanto with both hands. With no time for her to react, his blade struck her abdomen. Once again, he met the strange shell-like barrier on her skin, but this time, he felt something give way, and with a loud breaking sound, several cracks appeared on her skin. Grimacing in pain, Fu jumped back. A thin line of red blood was trickling down her front. In another flash, Naruto was behind her again with his tanto, slamming the blade ruthlessly this time against her back. Even as it crushed through her shell, to his surprise, she reached out with a hand and grabbed the blade. Opening her mouth, she turned her head and silently screamed, unleashing a gale of scale powders at his face. Forced to abandon his tanto, Naruto flashed away to the opposite side of the arena where he was just out of her reach. He watched as, with a hiss of pain, Fu wrenched the blade out from where it was wedged in between the cracks of her arm and threw it on the ground. Then, putting her hands together to make a sign, the top of the red tube on her back flew open and a black cloud of clicking insects emerged. They were different from the termite insects she had used previously. These looked more like beetles, but with a row of several wicked-looking pincers. As one, they headed straight for him, their hard shells gleaming brilliantly. Futon, Kyavu, wind release, gale. He blew out a gale of strong wind, throwing most them off course as they flapped their scaly wings rapidly in a struggle to stay in the air. Meanwhile, following her beetles, Fu lunged towards him and making the signs rapidly, she began to exhale her signature scale powder at him. Before they fully escaped her mouth, however, Naruto kicked out with his feet, hitting her in the side. She fell to the ground several feet away, her powder exuding uselessly by her side. Using that time, Naruto ran to where Fu had flung down his tanto, and picked it back up. Running his wind chakra down its length, he flashed behind the dark-skinned genin, slashing at her once more. Leaving behind a dark long line of blood, he quickly flashed away before her beetles, which were regrouping around her, could catch him. As she spat out a globule of blood and spit, Naruto dug his heel into the sandy ground in preparation for his next move, but stopped with a sudden yelp, as he felt numerous and tiny feet begin to crawl their way up his leg. Looking down in alarm, Naruto realized belatedly that several columns of Fu's termite had burrowed out from below ground. Without his noticing, they must have mixed with the swarm of beetles before disappearing underground. In his mind's eye, he recalled the eaten carcass of Kankuro's puppet. Already, he could feel them chewing through the leg of his tracksuit. Sending another wave of lightning chakra down his leg, Naruto flashed away, slapping down at his leg as he did so. Turning his hand up, he saw the smeared bodies of the insects across his palm. Thankfully, the remaining insects had fallen off as he escaped. However, this presented a new dilemma. Either Naruto would have to keep moving around to avoid them, or he would have to deal with them somehow, and with the beetles and Fu already chasing him around, that would make this even more difficult. Making up his mind, he cut off the current of wind chakra he was sending down his tanto, and instead began channeling lightning chakra down it. With a crackle, the blade began to hum as the chakra ran along its length. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see the swarm of beetles diving towards him once more. Fu remained in her position, seemingly concentrating on manipulating her insects all at once. The termites were nowhere to be seen, but were likely making a beeline towards him underground once more. Readying his tanto with both hands, Naruto took a step back, burrowing his heel into the ground. He felt a droplet of sweat begin to ease down the side of his face. The beetles were almost on top of him, something tiny was popping out of the ground's surface, and thrusting the tanto down into the sandy earth, Naruto simultaneously flashed away. As the blade broke through the surface, crackles of bright blue electricity from its tip broke the ground into chunks around it, surging through the emerging termites. At the same time, a current of electricity surged up through the blade into the air directly above it, electrocuting the swarm of airborne beetles. As one, the twitching, blackened insect bodies all dropped down on the ground. A final current of electricity crackled across the ground, before everything was still. Breathing heavily, Naruto fell on one knee to rest. Wearily, he looked in Fu's direction, and recoiled. She glared at him balefully, her face contorted into anger at the sight of her insect's demise. The sudden dark intensity of it inadvertently made him want to take a step back. Naruto hesitated, his every nerve was urging him with growing intensity to escape. Even as he watched, something red and ominous began to emanate off of her in waves. Somehow, her chakra had made itself visible. The pupils of her orange eyes grew narrow and sharp. White fog was steaming off of the cracks in her skin, and before his very eyes, they faded away, leaving her skin behind as good as new. The malicious red chakra shivered around her, before suddenly seeping to her back and splitting into two long shapes. Insect wings, Naruto realized, as they began fluttering behind her. His eyes wide, he regarded the girl that now took off into the air before him. Even at a distance, he could tell that she was somehow much faster and stronger now. Was she using the power of the tailed beast? Naruto glanced at the stands filled with the watching audience. Though most of them looked taken aback or confused, he noted that the Kazekage's face had not changed at all. Rather, the man looked attentively, almost eagerly, down at them, as if collecting information. Returning his attention to the match, Naruto blinked in shock. In that split second, Fu had flown across the entire length of the arena. Without his lightning chakra, he would have been done for already. As it was, he barely had enough time to lift up his arms to brace himself as she dove straight down at him. Her fingers had sharpened into what could only be called claws, and they dug painfully into the sides of his arms. The impact was so powerful, even as Naruto braced himself, he was blown off of his feet and sent tumbling across the sand. Before he could gain his bearings, he felt her claws settle around his legs, and suddenly, there was nothing below him, as she lifted him clear off the ground. Futon, Kyavua, wind release, gale. Rapidly making the signs, he arched up and blew out at the winged girl. Struggling not to be swept away by the strong wind, Fu was forced to release him. Landing on the ground, Naruto somersaulted back to his feet and immediately made the hand seals for his next move. Instantly, several clones materialized beside him, each panting along with him as they looked up at the flying, glittering figure above them. "You can't beat me," Fu called out from above. A cruel, eager smile played at the edges of her lips. "You may have noticed by now, but my teammates fear me for a reason." Lunging for his tanto, he turned just in time to raise it protectively before him. Reaching out with a claw, Fu grabbed the blade, heedless of it digging into her shell-like skin. For a second, the two struggled, each pushing against the tanto with all of their strength. With frustration, he saw as his clones tried to strike the Jinchuriki girl. However, her chakra insect wings lashed out through them and in an instant, they were all gone. Thinking quickly, Naruto loosened his hold on the tanto enough to catch Fu off guard. Slackening her push just enough, he managed to yank the blade out of her reach and flash away. Appearing behind her in an instant, he raised the tanto high above his head. As exhausted as he was, as Naruto pushed the remainder of his chakra into its length, he did not have the time or the focus to shape it into one of his elements as he usually did. Simply willing it to spin as uncontrollably and powerfully as possible at the blade's tip, he brought down the tanto through the air with a sharp splitting sound. The sand exploded at his feet and chunks of earth flew through the air. With a shattering sound, Naruto felt the metal blade crack in two from the impact. Behind it, his body jarringly hit the ground, his eyeballs rolled around in his rattled skull, and he tumbled across the ground several times before finally coming to a stop. For the first time in a long time, Naruto felt completely spent. Panting heavily, he remained still on the ground, waiting for sand to settle down. He had lost. He'd known, the moment he struck down. Her reaction speed honed by the red-tailed beast chakra, Fu had managed to dodge that final blow, with all of his remaining strength in it. Sure enough, a collective gasp swept across the mesmerized audience, as a grimy but perfectly fine Fu emerged from the dissipating dust clouds. Landing on the ground and folding her wings behind her, she threw a victorious smile in his direction. Leisurely, she began to walk toward him, like a prayer mantis slowly creeping up on its prey. It was completely silent. Turning away, Naruto let his head fall back. He looked up, there was not a single cloud in the blue sky. The sun's rays dazzled his eyes, and he let them close shut. The sudden blackness was soothing, and he felt his consciousness circle around his body. His heartbeat, which had been palpitating rapidly, slowed down. Offhandedly, Naruto wondered if he was going to die. Nobody was going to stop the match. Perhaps it was for the better. He was tired of trying. No matter what he did, it hadn't, and wouldn't make a difference. All those years, what had he been trying to prove? The moment the Nine Tails had been sealed inside of him, his fate had been sealed along with it. He was forever meant to. Naruto. A high voice cut through his hazy thoughts. Caught off guard at the sound of his name, he automatically opened his eyes. The sunlight beat down on his eyes once more, and wincing, he craned his head up, and froze. Looking fiercely down at him, a girl with long brown hair stood determinedly on top of the stands. "Mayu," Naruto said out loud incredulously at the sight of his teammate. From the corner of his eye, he saw that even Fu had temporarily paused. With her head cocked, she regarded the girl with puzzled eyes. "Is that all you've got?" Naruto! Mayu shouted down at him, cupping her hands around her mouth to magnify her voice. You're going to become Hokage, aren't you? He looked back up at the stands. His eyes felt hot, the watching crowd was growing blurry. Only the pale, worried faces of his teammate and his sensei stood out in sharp focus. Suddenly, as something white and red shot towards him, Mayu cried out in alarm, Naruto! Tumbling over, Naruto was back on his feet, the sand where he had just been lying down on burst apart from the impact of Fu's sudden blow. Dredging for the very last of his chakra, he flashed farther away to safety. Across the arena, Fu glared warily at him. She was back in the air, hesitating about what her next move should be. Rapidly, Naruto's mind raced through his available options. The only way out of this would be to take her out in a blow strong enough to kill, or knock her unconscious. However, he was out of chakra and was physically exhausted, while his opponent was currently high on tailed beast chakra and quite possibly the strongest person he had ever faced before. But his vision was clearer than it had been in a long time. As always, whenever in a tight bind, Naruto withdrew into the sanctuary of his mind. But this time, he realized for the first time that the giant block that had been restricting it before had been moved to one side. There was just enough room to squeeze past it, and when he did, he saw that there was a long, watery corridor that led off into the darkness. Hesitantly, he took a step forward and suddenly, he stood before a tall metal gate. He could feel something huge and dark lurking behind it, but a single seal on the gate doors blocked its escape. Come closer. A terrible voice filled his head. It was raw and brutal, as if it had been screaming for days on end until blood ran down its throat. You must be Ninetales, Naruto said quietly. In response, a massive clawed paw suddenly swiped through the bars of its prison, just barely falling short of tearing straight through him. He didn't move, calmly looking into the blackness. Just beyond the bars, he could make out the shadowy shape of something white and bloodshot glaring balefully back at him. What do you want? It snarled gutturally. Lend me your chakra, he said. It was clear to everyone watching that somehow, in that split second, a sudden change had come over the Konoha genin. Fu, the Taki genin, noticed as well, looking alarmed. She had stopped her approach. Ah, my tanto broke, the red-headed boy said, looking put out at the sight of his broken weapon. I guess I'll have to do without it this time. What's going on? Said Fu, cocking her head. Just a second ago, you were completely out of chakra. The boy thought about it for a second. I collected some rent, he said. With a scowl, looking as if she deeply regretted taking her time, Fu shot forwards at him with her arms outstretched. It was clear she meant to finish him at last, with one blow. In response, Naruto crouched down, holding one hand over the other. Something chaotic and destructive spun wildly between them. Meeting his opponent's hard gaze, he leapt forward. The two met each other head-on with an explosive bang that rocked the stadium, and a shockwave of dust and sand swept through the arena. When it had cleared, only one silhouette remained standing. Chapter 16, Glow of a Firefly. At the ripe old age of 5, Fu had quite confidently decided, in her not-so-humble opinion, that her home was the most beautiful place in the world. She lived in the village of Takigakur, an abode which nestled at the edges of the roots of an ancient, colossal tree that guarded them from the rest of the world. It towered over a sparkling clear lake which was pure enough to drink directly from, and farther down, a thin but regal waterfall, the namesake of their village, tumbled down over the side of a cliff. Fu and her mother lived together in a small, modestly decorated house at the farthest edge of the village, but they were also the closest to the guardian tree, so Fu never minded. The other village children never liked her anyways. Whenever she tried to join them as they played swim tag through the underwater roots, they threw rocks at her and told her to go away. It hurt, but Fu wasn't alone. She had her mother, a quiet older woman with long green hair and dark eyes. When her mother wasn't tired after a full day spent working in the village rice paddies, she would hold her hand and carry her up the trunk of the guardian tree to a faraway branch where they would sit and talk and laugh. She also had her pets. For her birthday present one year, her mother gave Fu a tank with a colony of white shirori, which were termite-like insects. A multitude of insects lived alongside the village people at the roots of the guardian tree, and it wasn't uncommon to adopt them as pets. Fu thought they were quite cute, with the way they squirmed around her fingers. At first, she'd had to take care of them outdoors. After all, if they escaped, they could very well eat through the wooden frames of their house. However, once she'd found that she could control them if she fed them her chakra, her mother had allowed her to bring them inside their home. And finally, she had Kome, a blue kabutomushi beetle, that lived inside her mind. "I think I'll try adopting some kabutomushi too," she told him, stroking his green wings. "So you'll have more beetle friends like yourself." "For the 7th time, I'm not a beetle," he said tiredly. "Whatever you say," she said, giving him a thumbs up. If Fu had to decide what the best part of Takigakure was, it would have to be the Firefly Festival. Every summer, the festival was the one night a year when everyone's houses were dark. All the villagers rowed out to the lake in their canoes with their lanterns. When the sun set and everything was pitch black around them, they opened them and let the fireflies fly out. The glowing fireflies and their reflections in the lake illuminated their boats, reminding them of all of their loved ones who had died in battle. Fu and her mother often prayed for her father. She'd never known him, as he'd died just before she was born, but she did know that he was a ninja who had fought in the war. "How about I get some fireflies too?" she pondered, rubbing his shell exactly where he liked it. Kome snorted. "They're fragile, and die far too quickly. Stick to the ones you've already got." "I stuck some of my baby Shirori on Mushimi yesterday," Fu grinned. He kept scratching, and he didn't know why. "He thinks he has lice now, and his uncle's furious." "Nice." Kome wiggled his tail in his best impression of a thumbs up. When Fu's mother died when she was 7, her world suddenly grew ugly. Their house was too big for one girl, and as time passed by, mold and fungus crept into its cracks and it slowly fell into disrepair. It was alright in the summer, and there was always plenty of fish in the lake, so she never went hungry. But as the cold breeze of winter began licking at her toes, Fu realized that she would have to do something. After being refused by every repairman in the village, she tried to clear away the weeds and board up the holes herself, but it was beyond her. Nevertheless, she kept at it every day, licking her bruises where she'd hammered her own fingers instead of the wood as Kome performed cheering routines in her head. It was one such winter evening that Gobuki, the village leader, approached her. He was a stern-faced man with dark hair. Fu knew that they were distantly related through her father, but he had never come near their house before, so the only times she had seen him were during the Firefly Festival. Unlike the rest of the village people, Gobuki wasn't cruel, but he was still a practical man who told her in matter-of-fact tones that Kome was actually a monster that had been sealed inside her, and that she was expected to learn ninjutsu and use his powers to kill the village's enemies. "I don't want to kill people," said Fu, after thinking it over. Gobuki paused and looked at her oddly as he stroked his beard. "Well, that's what you were born for. A lot of good ninja sacrificed their lives capturing Kome so it could be sealed in you." "Not my fault," Kome interjected in her head, making a rude gesture at Gobuki. Fu cocked her head to the side. "Why me?" "Your mother offered you," Gobuki said flatly. "Which I always found odd, considering your father was one of the ninja killed by Kome." No, the world had never been as beautiful as she'd thought. And so, over the years, Fu trained under a variety of teachers who made little effort to contain their hatred for her. Grudgingly, they acknowledged that she was clever and a quick learner, but most abandoned their post after several months, unable to stand being in such constant contact with the village monster. Nevertheless, she mastered all the basic genin-level ninjutsu by the time she was 11. Then, working with Kome, she began working to gain greater control over the Seven Tails power until she could even begin to change form and adopt some of his capabilities. The first time she managed to project 2 scaly wings like Kome's, heedless of the fact that it was nighttime and that she was exhausted, she flew up the guardian tree. Even with the temperature dropping rapidly, she flew higher up than she'd ever gone before, until she finally its very peak. The view took her breath away. With wide eyes, Fu slowly took in the open canvas of the black sky, which reached endlessly out in every direction, ending only where it touched the expanse of dark forest that surrounded them. She'd never been able to see the sky properly before, because the treetops blocked so much of it. Raising a hand up, Fu marveled at how many of them there were. She hadn't realized that there were a million stars that hung like fireflies, lighting up a faraway world that was out of her reach. One day, when Gobuki had gone away on a secret mission, the village deputy who'd been left in charge summoned Fu. He was a thin, dark-skinned man named Hike with narrow, guarded eyes. Unlike Gobuki, he'd never hidden the fact that he despised the Taki Jinchuriki. He told her there would be a Chunin exam in Sunagakure in a week, and that she was to go there with one of the Taki team cells. Upon meeting her new teammates, Mushimi and Suzuru, Fu scowled. Mushimi, as she quickly recalled, had been one of her old tormentors. He was Hike's nephew, and he eyed her with intense loathing as soon as he'd laid eyes on her. As soon as she'd finished carefully inserting the last of her shirori and kabutamushi into a padded wooden tube which she then strapped to her back, Fu was whisked off to Sunagakure. As expected, the Chunin exams were a breeze. For the first exam, in which they had to break apart the opposing team's boulder, all she had to do was send over her cute little shirori at the opposing team to distract them, while simultaneously crawling into any cracks in the rock. With a stern order to her shirori to not eat the genin, their rock soon fell apart and they passed. The next exam, Mushimi and Suzuru immediately abandoned her and ran off with their team plate, which was fine with her. The idiots of course got their team plate stolen by another team. She hunted and took back the team plate, and then with vindictive pleasure, frolicked around her tied-up teammates as they glared at her sullenly. She then burrowed inside a dead-end tunnel near the surface to take a nap, but accidentally mistimed it. Nevertheless, Komei frantically shook her awake just in time to meet the exam's deadline. Despite that tiny mishap, the remainder of the exam was also going swimmingly, when something went wrong. Her preliminary went by in a flash. Afterwards, she couldn't even remember the names of her opponents. The Ome genin had gone down with little effort, but the other genin from Konoha had proved a little bit more tricky. She'd used a long-range medium for her genjutsu, with irritating squawking bluebirds that Fu had had to take great pains to avoid. But in the end, of course, it hadn't been a problem. After 2 weeks of loitering around, while making sure her shirori and kabutamushi were breeding properly, her following match came, and it wasn't much of a challenge for her either. Her opponent was a Suna genin who seemed to have an extraordinary amount of pride in his puppet. Her shirori had just bred recently, and she'd been making sure to keep them extra hungry. Fu took great pleasure in seeing his horrified expression after having them eat up his puppet in a few seconds. In the final match, as it should have been, Fu faced off against the other most powerful genin in the exam. He was a red-headed boy from Konoha, with a tanto that must have been at least half his short height strapped across his back. But despite his disarmingly young appearance, the genin, Naruto, had been making waves in the Chunin exams as an especially dangerous opponent to watch out for. The battle had been going more or less in the direction she expected, when the boy suddenly slammed his tanto into the ground and electrocuted all of her insects. "No!" she screamed, her vision flashing red as she watched them blacken and shrivel up. In her mind's eye, she recalled with a flash her mother's eager face as she watched Fu unwrap her birthday present. "Komei. You sure?" he asked uncertainly, tail whipping around fretfully. "I thought we'd agreed not to attract too much attention." But at her insistence, he reluctantly agreed, and she transformed into her initial Jinchuriki form before proceeding to pummel the brat into the ground where he belonged. Fu probably should have ended it there then, but she'd always had a rather nasty habit of playing with her fish before skewering them. The worn-out boy seemed to have given up all hope, and had just been lying still on the ground, his chest slowly rising up and down with every breath. To his credit, he did not seem altogether afraid. And then, Naruto. With some encouraging words from his teammate, the redhead was back on his feet with renewed strength in his eyes. Fu had been taken aback at first, watching with disbelief as it all happened, but she finally dove towards him with her hands outstretched. With her enhanced vision, she could see the artery in his neck pulsating. Just a single slash, and he'd be dead, and she'd have avenged her poor insects. There was something materializing in his hands. It was chakra, made so dense that it had become visible. Fu narrowed her eyes, but kept going. She was confident that there was no way it'd penetrate her hardened shell armor. They met each other head-on. Fu swiped at his neck, but he dodged. Nevertheless, she reached under his arms, and lifted him off the ground. As she did so, she felt the ball of chakra he'd summoned slam into her torso. The impact was so powerful, the sand around her exploded up with a bang like massive waves. hiding them from the watching eyes of the audience. Gritting her teeth, Fu held onto his struggling body, and streaked upwards to the sky. Letting out a hiss of pain, she felt the ball of chakra grind abrasively against her armor and begin to inch its way inwards to her flesh. With shock, she realized that her armor was cracking. Panting, Naruto determinedly continued to drive his hand against her. It was like a small contained storm that tore away at her shell as if it were made of paper. Before Fu could pass out from the pain, she dove, and just before they reached the ground, she released the boy. With another explosive crash, a shockwave of dust and sand swept through the arena. Gasping in agony, with blood dripping out through the gaping cracks of her armor, she soon dropped to the ground, her wings curled protectively around her. Black tendrils of unconsciousness began to creep upon her vision. When the sand had settled down, the match was over. Holding their breaths, the watching crowd quickly identified the victor. There was stunned silence. And then, the winner of the battle is Fu from Takigaku. The proctor announced, as shakily Fu got to her feet. At the other side of the arena, Naruto lay unmoving on the ground, his eyes closed. There was another long pause, and then the crowd rose to their feet, erupting into an uproarious round of applause. The Suna medics were already moving into the field with a stretcher, but a silver-haired jonin with a Konoha forward protector, likely the boy's sensei, stopped them. Beside him stood the girl who'd interrupted their battle. Come to think of it, she was the same girl who'd been a headache to deal with in the preliminaries. Fu couldn't quite place her name. She was white-faced as she followed the jonin, but just as they knelt beside the red-head genin, he stirred and opened his eyes. Naruto, said the girl, looking quite relieved as she threw her arms around the dazed boy. Ow, he winced, and she immediately let go, apologizing. The jonin asked him a few questions, to which Naruto shook his head no. Waving away the stretcher, the jonin and the girl helped him get up. Silently, Fu watched as they hobbled out of the arena together. What's wrong? Komei asked, sensing something was off. Nothing, she said, feeling a lump in her throat. Komei, you saw what happened with his sudden chakra surge. Do you think that kid is a Jinchuriki like me? Everyone knows Konoha got their hands on poor Kurama, Komei said contemplatively. Though we don't know who the vessel is right now. It's not unthinkable. Fu cocked her head, her brow furrowed. But his teammates don't hate him. Maybe he has a better personality than you, Komei offered. With the help of several brave, but wary Suna medicnen, Fu was soon patched up. Wincing as they healed her with the soothing blue glow of medical ninjutsu, she noticed Suzuru skulking around the bleachers. Oddly enough, however, Mushimi had disappeared. Even after scanning the entire stadium, she couldn't find him. She'd been half expecting an abrasive rebuke about her entering her Jinchuriki form. With a shrug, Fu stopped thinking about it. After an hour, the Chunin certification ceremony was held. All of the genins, having been more or less restored to a conscious state, stood in line before the Kaze Kage, who gave another boring speech about the honor that the title of Chunin held and the duty they owed their villages. And then, the names of the passing genin were called. Fu from Takigaku, said the Kaze Kage, glaring out at her from under his green-pointed Kage hat. Hopping up, she collected her Chunin certificate of achievement to polite applause. Rolling it up immediately, she stuffed it in her strap. Uzumaki Naruto from Konohagaku. No surprises there, looking much recovered, the red-headed genin walked up and accepted his certificate. Kankuro from Tsunagaku. This time, the Kaze Kage's face eased up just a bit as he looked down at his son. With a pat on his shoulder, the boy accepted his certificate with a bow, to enthusiastic applause. Hyuga Neji from Konohagaku. With a blank expression on his face, the boy took the certificate and walked away without any further response. And so on and so forth, 3 more genin were awarded the certificate, 2 from Omegaku, and another one from Konohagaku. The Konoha boy, who had a scar running down his face, looked stunned as he walked up to receive his certificate. But as soon as the paper was in his hand, and he'd examined it to make sure that it was real, the boy began jumping up and down in excitement. As he distastefully watched the boy holler, the look on the Kaze Kage's face made it clear that he was beginning to regret his decision. To end the ceremony, a row of Suna Jonin performed some impressive tricks with their jutsu, making fountains out of sparkling sand and giant structures that towered over them. And then, just as the sun was beginning to set, it was finally over. With an air of shooing the strangers out of their village, the Kazekage dismissed them all and disappeared. It was then that Mushimi finally appeared. Pocketing something that jangled in his pouch, he exchanged a meaningful glance with Suzuru. Then, turning to Fu with a scowl, he motioned towards the village gates with a jerking gesture. And so, they left Tsunagakure. As they began the long trek across the sand dunes back to their village, Fu couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. Mushimi and Suzuru seemed to be avoiding her gaze even more so than usual. Tense and sweating profusely, they looked around every now and then, as if expecting something. She glanced around at their surroundings, but all she could see was sand. "Something's up," said Fu, eyeing the boys in question. "I agree," said Kome. However, despite their unease, nothing happened the first day. But on the second day, just as they were nearing the border between Fire Country, Fu sensed them. As she realized that she was being watched, her senses grew hyper-alert. Without stopping, she began to pick up her pace, and soon, she had left her teammates behind. Her heart pounding, she raced across the tree branches of the heavily dense woodland. Suddenly, with a blur, a figure landed directly in front of her, blocking her way. Fu came to a stop. "Hold up there, kid." The man had slicked back silver hair, and was dressed in a long black cloak with red clouds and a chin-high collar. Fu's eyes darted to the blood-red scythe he held in his hand, and snarled, "What do you want with me?" Honestly. The man seemed to genuinely think it over, though his purple eyes never strayed from her face. A gruesome smile lit up his face. "I want to offer you to my god, and by that I mean I want to tear your face up with my scythe, and feel your agony as I rip through your nerves, cell by cell, reveling in your every." "Shut up and do your job, newbie." A gruff voice joined in. Fu spun around in shock to see a tall man in a similar black cloak, with a black mask covering much of his face. He wore a taki forehead protector, but there was a slash running straight across the middle. Taking in his bizarre appearance, Fu knew for sure that she had never seen him before in her life. As she watched, the tall man tossed something to the side, and it took a second for Fu to process what it was. When she realized, she jerked back in alarm. Mushimi and Suzuru's decapitated heads, still dripping blood at the base of their necks, stared back at her with shocked, glassy eyes. "Not that I care," said the purple-eyed man, "but I thought we made a deal with them." "They had only half the money they promised," growled the tall man. He turned his pupil-less green eyes towards Fu, who took a step back. "Let's show them what we can do, Kome," she said, ignoring the trembling in her legs. After a long, hard day of traveling, they had finally left behind the deserts of Wind Country and were at the edges of Fire Country. However, with still a half-day's journey left from Konoha, they had set up camp for the night. After a satisfying dinner with some prairie chickens they caught and then roasted over the campfire, Rai and Mayu finally collapsed in exhaustion. Sporadically mumbling words like "I passed," and "I'm a chinin," in his sleep, Rai snored away on the grassy ground. Next to him, Mayu dozed in her sleeping bag with a peaceful look on her face. And occasionally stoking the campfire with a stick, Kakashi read a book by the fire's light. Unable to fall asleep, Naruto reclined on top of a nearby boulder that was covered with light fuzz of moss, looking up at the night sky. Tomorrow, they would be back in Konoha. Naruto was just as happy as the others to finally leave behind the bleak, endless sandy plains of Tsunagakure, but he didn't know how he felt about returning to their home village. He didn't want to see any of their faces. He didn't know if he could ever forgive what they'd done to him. His entire life, they'd lied to him but still subjected him to their hatred and ridicule. They'd never even given him a chance to figure things out for himself, controlling him by tying him down with the taboo seal, as if he were nothing but a senseless, rabid beast. If Konoha could do that to an ignorant, innocent child, what did the village ideals he'd always believed in even signify? The will of fire was taught to every child, whether civilian or shinobi born, as a symbol of peace and compassion, but it had never seemed to extend towards him. Naruto supposed most of them had never even thought of him as one of them. His hands curled into fists by his side. That was fine with him, he no longer cared about them either. Or at least, he'd try not to. However, He gazed down at the sleeping figures of his teammates. The look on Mayu's face as she looked down upon him in the arena had been completely different from anything he'd seen before. There had been no fear, no disgust. There had been only trust, and an unwavering belief in him. And then in a bolt of realization, Kakashi-sensei's words had flashed through his mind. So you're saying your efforts were all to get people to acknowledge you? That doesn't sound like the Naruto I know. Naruto hadn't responded then, but at that moment, his answer had been suddenly clear in his mind. He hadn't been striving all those years to hear praise from faceless villagers who spat at him. He'd been doing his best to stand out for that one day when someone, anyone, noticed him. Not as Naruto the village pariah, or Naruto the Jinchuriki, but as Naruto the Konoha ninja. He had wanted the strength to protect them. But in chasing after that dream, he'd gotten so caught up in its mechanics that he hadn't even realized that he was already surrounded by people who saw him for himself. Naruto turned to look at the sleeping forms of his teammates. They didn't know, of course, that he had the Nine Tails trapped inside of him. Kakashi-sensei had told him that they would be going directly to the Hokage as soon as they returned to Konoha, but that until then, nobody else was to find out. How would they react? Rai's words, from back when they were in the deep underground caves of Suna, swam hauntingly around in his head. I guess you already know that you were born on the day of the Nine Tails attack. My parents were killed on that day. Naruto's heart sank. Surely they would realize that Naruto wasn't the Nine Tails itself. That he was just an unwilling vessel for the beast that had killed their loved ones. Struggling to contain the raging thoughts in his head, Naruto sighed. Letting his head fall back against the moss-covered rock, he looked up at the star-filled sky. Raising a hand, he stared at the outline of his hand. Several hundreds of feet away, tucked in the shadows of the surrounding forest, a solitary figure in a long black cloak with red cloud motifs silently observed the campsite. His face was obscured by an orange mask that spiraled inwards, opening up into an eye hole on his right. Ignoring the two sleeping genin completely, his red gaze lingered on the jonin for a second before resting on the red-headed genin who lay awake. The figure stood completely still, watching. He watched as the genin eventually drifted into a fitful sleep. He watched the jonin sleep, periodically waking up to stoke the campfire. For hours, he watched and watched. Then, there was a hiss and then a distorted flickering in his consciousness. We've got the Jinchuriki, a voice spoke in his head telepathically. We're beginning the extraction process now. Finally, he roused himself. With one last look at the sleeping ninja, he turned to leave, stepping on a leaf as he did so. At the faint sound, the silver-haired jonin's eyes immediately snapped open, and getting up with a start, the man peered with narrowed eyes at where the figure had been silently watching. But there was nobody there. He was gone now, but he would keep watching. He was always watching. After several days of nothingness, Fu suddenly realized that she had been given bodily form once more. She was floating in a pitch-black world. There was nothing around her, above her, or below her. But somehow, she was there. She felt weak and tired, and even though she had just awakened, she wanted nothing more than to go back to sleep. With a jolt, she realized that it was eerily quiet where she was. She couldn't remember the last time it had been so quiet. Where was Kome? Kome! Fu called out softly, taking a step forward. Despite there being nothing there, her foot held in the blackness, so she took another step forward. Kome! She kept calling out his name, but he never answered. After some time, Fu finally realized that he wasn't there. She was the only person there. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. You know, I really wanted those fireflies. She whispered into the darkness. But of course, nobody responded. Fu closed her eyes, and everything faded away. That's it for part 3. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.